Welcome to JS on Politics. I'm your host, Greg Borowski, and we have another full show this week. Here's a look at what we've got coming up. We'll talk about the Badger Guns verdict and a plan to allow guns on college campuses. Paul Ryan is still resisting the call to become House Speaker. We'll look at the debate over whether he is conservative enough. In Madison, Republicans are moving toward undoing the Government Accountability Board. And in Milwaukee County, a Chris versus Chris battle is shaping up for the county executive's office next spring. And of course, we'll take some viewer questions. But first, we'll start with lawyers, guns, and money. I'm joined by John Diedrich, one of our federal courts, and who's been following the Badger Guns case. Karen Herzog, our higher education reporter. We'll start with the Badger case, and before we get to some questions, we're going to run a little video of the attorney after the verdict. This is the attorney for the police officers, Patrick Dunphy, talking about what happened with the jury.
I think probably the most significant testimony that we got was from the former owner, Milton Butovic. I think when he acknowledged that everything that went on that day was one red flag after another, and that the man he trained to make a sale should have seen that, and that it wasn't reasonable for him to sell. I thought that was very important and very convincing.
Your rebuttal was quite emphatic. Do you credit that?
My rebuttal? I don't credit myself with anything. I credit the jury with listening to the evidence.
How do you feel about the amount that you guys received?
Well, it's an amount that I'm very content with. I mean, the jury awarded what they thought was appropriate, and I have no problems with that. Juries disagree with me all the time on how much something is worth. Sometimes they award more, sometimes they award less, but they always award the right number because it's the number they pick. I was very pleased that the jury came back with what they did, because it clearly showed they listened to the evidence and they went along with the evidence. They weren't persuaded by anything I said. Otherwise, I would have won on all those issues, and I didn't. So they based their verdict on the evidence.
All right, John, let me ask you a little bit about the case. You're covering it from the beginning, and a lot of the things that led up to the case, from the investigations on Badger Guns and Badger Outdoors. Do you think, what's the fallout of the verdict here? Will there be more cases like this, or is this so unique in the circumstances that it'd be hard to replicate?
Well, it is only the second case of its kind to go to a jury here in 10 years since a federal law passed, making these cases very difficult. So, and it's the first one where a jury's found in favor of the plaintiffs against the gun dealer. So, talking to experts and looking at cases around the country, it's likely to give plaintiffs some hope that they have a chance to win. But as you note, the fact set is really specific in this case. Some very egregious examples of straw buying captured on video in the surveillance video. So, my sense is that, yeah, we'll see more cases, but will they be successful? Time will tell.
And what's the immediate future on this case? I mean, it's not like a check is being written to the police officers today. It's got a long way through the court system itself.
That's right. Patrick Dunphy, who was just in the clip there, he referenced this is the beginning of a years-long fight. Badger Guns' attorney has already indicated that they're going to appeal. This is likely to end up in the state Supreme Court and perhaps even the U.S. Supreme Court if they see enough of a federal jurisdictional issue here. So the money will not be going to the officers anytime soon. They're ready for that. They're ready for a long fight. But the significance is still being felt out there in terms of what gun shops may do differently around the country is another impact to look for.
Yeah, I suppose it'd be a good sort of warning, reminder to them of the care you need to take in these circumstances, because while it was egregious, you want to be sure everything is done properly to avoid these straw sales.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the one of the takeaways is whether industries, and especially big box stores, who have deeper pockets in some of these individual stores. I mean, we may be seeing some more training and just, again, concern that they want to make sure that they do not leave themselves open to liability like this.
All right, let me bring in, we have Patrick Marley joining us from Madison, and as always, it's often there's an action and then a reaction in the legislative end. Do you see anything yet, or do you foresee any changes proposed in Madison of ways to give further protections to the gun stores, or to do things of that nature?
Well, certainly I would expect that kind of reaction eventually. Republicans have felt very strongly about concealed carry rights and protecting the gun industry. Now, I haven't heard anything specific as to this case and a need on they're feeling a need that they need to do something. But I think they'll watch the case closely. I would expect it to get to the state Supreme Court, and if it got to a decision that they didn't like, They might see some changes that they need to make there. I think they'd also keep a careful eye out for whether this spawns a flood of other lawsuits to see what the concerns are. But because it's a narrow case, because the facts are very specific, we just haven't seen a huge legislative reaction at this point.
All right. Well, we are seeing a legislative action on a different front, which is guns on college campuses. And Karen, you wrote this week about a new proposal that would basically allow them on campuses where they're not allowed currently. What's behind that measure, and where do you see it going?
Well, the campus shootings that have occurred around the country in recent weeks and months have driven a lot of discussion about what can we do to keep students and faculty safe. Some people think it's putting guns in the hands of those who are potential targets. And this first bill that was introduced earlier this week was from Representative Jesse Kramer. He wants to allow those who have concealed carry permits to be able to take guns inside university buildings. Currently, you can have firearms on the grounds, technically, of these public universities and colleges. However, University of Wisconsin system has administrative code that prohibits that. They basically don't want anybody to have guns anywhere on campus.
Yeah, well, Patrick, let me ask you, it's not too many years removed from when the concealed carry legislation went through in the first place. Was this part of the debate at the time? Did they consciously say we're going to not allow them on campuses, or what do you see causing this to come up now as an issue?
Yeah, this has been a big split within lawmakers, but even within among Republicans. The advocates of concealed carry say, the point is that you should be able to have the gun wherever you need to go, and that if there are a bunch of places carved out where you can't carry them, then the bad guys know where to go to cause these terrible shootings. And so they feel that it should be pretty broad support, or a broad ability to carry wherever you need. Others felt like there's certain areas, schools and higher education where you shouldn't have them. And so this compromise that they reached was that on state properties, it's sort of a local, you give some authority to individual places to make the decisions. The university has made the decision to keep them out of buildings. Certainly, we see this afoot now to try to change that. And now I don't know that it has the kind of momentum it would need to get passed in this session, which really only carries through in the spring. You've got some advocates for it, but you haven't seen a lot of leaders jump onto it. The governor hasn't come out strongly for it, so its chances, I'm not sure what they are at this point.
All right, well, we'll leave our discussion of guns there and go right now to a tape segment with a look at Paul Ryan and what his future holds. We're joined now by Craig Gilbert, our Washington Bureau Chief, to talk about one of the big questions in Washington, which is who's the next House Speaker. And Craig, you have a story online today about Paul Ryan looking at his conservative record. We always thought he was a pretty conservative guy. Now he's apparently not conservative enough. Give us a sense of what's the dynamic at play here.
Well, he's right now the overwhelming choice of his House Republican colleagues, but there are some Republicans on the Hill, some conservatives on the Hill, and some conservatives kind of in the activist community who have a problem with him, and they don't think he's conservative enough. They don't think he's aggressive enough. It's kind of a minority viewpoint, but it's still pretty striking to have anybody within the conservative movement or the Republican Party questioning Ryan's conservative credentials to that degree when you consider how conservative he's been. Political scientists have a system for rating the ideology of members of Congress over the years based on how they vote. And by their numbers, Paul Ryan is not only more conservative than the vast majority of his House Republican colleagues, but he would be the most conservative House Speaker in our lifetime, basically. I mean, you have to go back before World War II and before the Great Depression to find a Republican Speaker with a voting record as conservative as his is.
Yeah, so I mean, to functionally and make it work, I mean, he would want, it seems, unanimity among his caucus. He wouldn't want to be elected with requiring Democratic support, but do you see any way to get that unanimity given the pushback?
I think the path to getting it is you have a caucus of 35 or 40. It's called the Freedom Caucus. These are the most conservative members of the House. These are the ones that kind of helped force John Boehner out. Some people think that he can pick off about half of those people one way or another, that he'd be acceptable to them, that he can get their support. And that would give him a functioning majority. I mean, the question is whether he can really do this on his own terms. He doesn't really want to do it if he has to make concessions. to this group. I mean, they want to kind of whittle down the role of the speaker a little bit. They want more power to do things bottom up rather than top down. There may be a few things they like and want that other Republicans could agree to, but Paul Ryan really does want to do this on his own terms, and he does have some leverage in the sense that, you know, he's not a candidate. He said a million times he doesn't want to do the job, so he's just in effect being drafted to do the job, so he's trying to do it under the best possible circumstances if he says yes.
Yeah, so what are some of the issues where the people who think he's not conservative enough, where they differ with him on? What votes are troubling to them?
Yeah, there aren't a lot of them. I mean, you know, it's really about sort of tone and tactics. I mean, there are some Republicans who just want the party to be as confrontational as possible in pushing legislation that they know can't pass or won't survive a veto, even if it means, you know, a budget crisis or bringing the government to a halt. And Paul Ryan hasn't been one of those, and so he's voted for spending bills and essentially spending deals in some cases with Democrats that have allowed the government to keep functioning rather than go off a fiscal cliff or have a government shutdown or have a real budget crisis. There are, you know, a few issues. The biggest one is probably immigration, where he does part company with some on the right. I mean, he has been more liberal on immigration than a lot of House Republicans, but he hasn't really been a crusader on that issue. I mean, he's generally voted with his party, and I think he's been careful not to get too far away. You know, a few other scattered issues, but on the vast majority of things, you know, he is a very reliable conservative vote, and the data tells us that he's a more conservative vote than most of his colleagues.
Yeah, it seems that at some level he's being criticized for being too pragmatic, but then you don't have a real pragmatic viewpoint of those who are opposing him, because who else will they find, do you think, who could please everybody in the caucus?
Well, that's his attraction, you know, to the caucus, is that he does kind of bridge those divisions better than almost anyone else who seems to be available. I mean, one of the ironies is that Paul Ryan, you know, was kind of the trailblazer on the conservative side of his party in pushing these pretty drastic budgets. His roadmap, which was hugely controversial. I mean, so controversial that some Republicans thought it was just too risky for the party, and he pushed his caucus to get behind it. So it's kind of odd to see that guy being attacked for not being conservative enough by some people. But he's also, you know, he's a committee chairman. He chaired the Budget Committee. He's now chairing the Ways and Means Committee. So he is not technically a member of leadership, but he's one of the leaders of the House. And, you know, he is trying to be part of a functional House.
All right, we'll leave it there. You can find Craig's story online today at jsonline.com. Thanks, Craig.
You're welcome.
All right, we're back live and joined now by Dan Bice, our Watchdog columnist, to talk about some of the other topics. And first up, we're going to look at the government accountability reforms in Madison. And to set the table for that, we're going to show this video here of the governor talking about his take on what and support for those measures.
Certainly when it comes to the Government Accountability Board, I appreciate the focus they put on what I said would be my hope for reform, and that is a bipartisan effort, so you have an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, and then particularly having clerks involved. I think it's important to have people who actually run the local elections. That hasn't been done historically in the past through the GAB or even in the past in previous versions of the State Elections Board. I think having clerks, the people who at the local level actually have to run those elections, having a fair representation from both parties, I think going forward will give us the ability to have not just a good format, good reform, but one that will be practical in the ability to get things done and make sure elections run smoothly here in the state.
All right, well, let's go to Patrick Marley in Madison now. So Patrick, the governor just described this bipartisan support he's hoping to build for the government accountability reforms. Do you see any sign of that in Madison? It certainly doesn't appear at this moment to be a bipartisan effort.
Yeah, the chance that any Democratic legislators vote for this bill to overhaul the Government Accountability Board is about zero at this stage. You're going to vote for it in the Assembly on Tuesday. Democrats are just absolutely very strongly opposed to this. Republicans say that it's a great reform and will give us a better election system, a better way to oversee the ethics of public officials. But there's just no agreement at all between the parties.
Yeah, I mean, so the governor in his comments, he was talking about how he wants to get local clerks involved, but does much in this bill affect how they do their job, or is it more just the board and the overseeing, the higher level sort of things that are affected?
Well, so the Accountability Board has two major roles. They run elections in the state, and they oversee ethics and lobbying laws and campaign finance laws. They're going to split those into two agencies, so there will be one agency dedicated to elections. It'll be 6 members, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and that'll include 2 former clerks, 1 from each party. So the feeling there among the Republicans is that you'll have the input of the local clerks, because they have been frustrated over the years with the number of changes that have been made to the way we would conduct elections. Not necessarily that they thought it was good policy or bad policy, just that they thought there was too much change too close to elections. And so the feeling is that if you have those voices there at the table of the folks who run elections day to day, they can say, we need more time for this, or we can cut down on some bureaucracy here or there, we can prevent voter fraud in some ways.
All right, let me ask you, Dan. So in this past, when the boards, these 2 boards, we used to have 2 boards, and they were basically merged and became one board, there was more bipartisan support back then, right?
There was a great deal of frustration at that point with how the Elections Board and the Ethics Board worked. They were overtly political, and you could count heads and say this many Democrats are on the board, this number of Republicans, they're likely to do this, they're likely to do that. And there was a lot of frustration because they didn't do much of anything. There would be a stalemate, or if there were action, it was always political. And both Republicans and Democrats favored this more independent. I won't say independent because it's run by judges, but judges, as we know, have outlooks and perspectives and political biases. But this time around, it's obviously driven by the Republicans. And this isn't about the government accountability so much. It's primarily about the John Doe investigations of Scott Walker and the Republicans. And this is one of their attempts to fight back at that and to prevent any similar John Doe from occurring again.
Right. So how do you think that plays with the public if there's this bipartisan support for the board, and now there's one side wanting to undo it seemingly for some advantage to themselves?
Truthfully, I don't think the majority of people in the public have any idea what a government accountability board is in the first place. They might know what a John Doe investigation is and what the outcome is from the board, but it's a very much an inside baseball thing, but it's something that the Republicans care deeply about because it affected them, affected careers. People went to prison over some of this stuff, and so they care about the issue. There was someone at the Cap Times who did an open records request of Robin Voss's office who said he heard more about this issue than any other issue over the past 2 years. And she discovered that he had received a total of 13 emails on the topic. So it doesn't seem like there's overwhelming public concern about this.
Right, yeah. I mean, Patrick, what's your sense on that point? I mean, if there isn't that concern, then there's probably maybe not going to be much blowback either if it does go through.
Right. I think people who are really involved in politics and paying close attention and are partisans are going to have strong feelings. The Republicans are going to think it's great. The Democrats are going to think it's terrible. But I agree with Dan that the broad class of people in the state aren't paying attention at this level and are not going to have an opinion about it. And the new board, the old board, the existing board is supposed to be nonpartisan. The new board will be evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. So I think people won't initially look at that and say that it's a partisan takeover. It'll look like it's evenly balanced. I think where the public is going to start paying attention and caring is how this thing is rolled out. It's going to come into effect in the middle of next year, a few months before a major election. If there are problems with the election, then I think people are going to be looking to the agency that runs it and questioning why that's happening. The truth be told, if things go without a hitch, it probably won't be noticed at all. But if any kinds of problems that emerge with the transition to these new boards, people will be looking at that, much like you saw with Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, which got off the ground really fast and encountered a number of problems and has kind of been a problem for Republicans in the years since.
A story you wrote about, no one really cares who runs the City Election Commission, but when the City Election Commissioner had a number of problems, then a lot of people cared about the outcome or the result.
That's a little walk down memory lane from my City Hall days.
The more interesting thing to me is when Walker was on the road running for president, I'd said on several occasions we had 2 governors instead of 1, and that was Senator Fitzgerald and Assembly Speaker Robin Voss. It's still their agenda that's driving these things. Walker's gotten on board and said he supports these reforms. He's also said he supports these civil service changes. But again, these are not his original ideas, and their agendas being pushed by very conservative Republicans. And his most recent polling numbers showing he was at 37%, shows that the moderates in the state have moved away from him. And I'm interested in seeing, and maybe Patrick is as well, what he's going to do on his own to try to win back those people. So far, in the months since he's dropped out, I haven't seen very much that he's done to reach out to the middle.
Yeah, Patrick, I just want to, that's a good little shift to a question I had about the governor. This week we heard him talk about, we're so sort of deconstructing his campaign, presidential campaign, and what's going on. He said if he were to do this again, he wouldn't do both at the same time. So I'm wondering, are there some tea leaves to be read here? Is that saying he's not going to seek a third term, or he will if a Republican wins? I mean, what's your take on the governor as he's thinking back on this failed bid from this summer?
Well, the first thing that's interesting is the big shift that you see from all of the time that he was running, and he was asked about whether he could handle both things at once. He said that was not a problem. Technology lets you stay in touch with your staff and legislators around the clock, and that it was very easy to do. And now that he's out, he says, well, that's too hard a task to do both, and he wouldn't do it again. I don't think he knows if he's going to run for a third term, and he's not even a year into the second term. I think he's wisely waiting to see, what his options are and what his numbers are at. I mean, right now it's his 37%. That's not a good place to run for re-election. He's got some time to try to rehabilitate that.
I think that's as close as you get to Scott Walker saying, I'm sorry. That's two words you never hear him say is, I'm sorry, or I messed up, or anything like that. This was as close to his saying, yeah, what everybody's been saying over the last 9 months.
They're kind of accurate.
They were probably right, and I wasn't.
Yeah. All right, well, let's shift to our next topic, which is Scott Walker's old job, currently held by Chris Abele, who's getting really probably his first serious competitor in the spring, State Senator Chris Larson. Dan, give us a sense of that matchup, and how do you see that playing out?
Well, Abele's been elected twice, once in 2011 in a field of 4 candidates. He emerged as the winner, spent a fair bit of money, and ran as the anti-Scott Walker. Since that time, he's moved to the center, specifically on fiscal issues, and has not been a strong supporter of labor unions. But on other issues, social issues, gay rights, and abortion rights and stuff, he's still very, very liberal. Chris Larson is to the left of him on fiscal issues, and he's a former supporter of Chris Abele, and he says that Chris isn't the same guy today that he helped elect back in 2011, so now he wants to take him on.
Well, and the other Gwen Moore is also now, I guess, a former supporter of Chris Abele because she's backed Chris Larson.
And another difference is, too, her son is now on the county board, and the county board, as everyone knows, does not get along with the county executive.
Yeah, Patrick, let me ask you, just for your general take on Chris Larson in Madison in the Senate. He's a former county board member, but for the last few years has been in leadership there. How would you characterize his work in the legislature?
Well, I mean, one thing to keep in mind, he's pretty new to the legislature. He ran in 2010 against incumbent Senator Jeff Plaley, who was a middle-of-the-road sort of conservative Democrat. Ran to him from one of the most liberal districts in the state Senate, with the sense that a liberal district should elect a liberal candidate. Ousted him in the primary, got in. Act 10 took off, and so he was sort of born into fire in Wisconsin politics at the state level. Went on to become the minority leader. Only did that a short time. He was replaced at the beginning of this session. The last set of elections did not go well. Usually if elections don't go well, the leader of that party does not stay in leadership. And that's where Chris Larson is today.
Yeah. I was talking to a group of Democrats yesterday about this, and the issue for them was, what is Chris Larson's message? What is he trying to do? He's trying to say, we need to get rid of Chris Abele for what reason? And they didn't see a very compelling reason that he's put out there so far.
Right. Well, I mean, and when you look at the fiscal picture, it's a lot better for the county than it was. And so what is the top issue? What is Chris Larson hammer on? Larson voted for the Bucks Arena, right? There was that picayune bit about the debt payments and who's going to do it. But
it sounds picayune, but it is $80 million over 20 years, and they did split on that, and that'll be significant. The other issues, I mean, it's going to be the labor unions who support Chris Larson in this, and they're much diminished these days as a result of Act 10, so they're not going to have the power and the influence. But that's what's going to drive this. This is going to become an attempt by the labor unions to oust Chris Abele. But who knows how much money he can spend on this? He's the son of a billionaire who has many millions in his own right, and so he's going to be able to go to the airwaves. The only problem is, and I wrote earlier this week about this, is he did make a number of promises when first elected in 2011, including freezing his office budget, not using a county car, a number of things like that. And he's reneged on those things. And his staff basically acknowledges that. They just say there's justification for it. So I'm going to expect Larson to pound him on some of those failed promises.
All right, that's a good spot to shift to our viewer questions. And this first one is actually related to this race, and it's from Same Old, who says...
We've had him before,
yeah,
haven't we?
I don't know, I think so. It's same old question from same old. It says, his question is, does Larson really have a chance, or will it just be Chris Abele dumping his big bucks into the race and continuing to buy the seat?
I never
What's the odds?
I never say nobody has a chance, because you never know. I mean, I'm reminded of an attorney general's race here where Peg Lautenschlager, people thought she had no chance, and then Brian Burke gets indicted and then convicted, and she becomes the attorney general. I think the chances are strongly in favor of Abele, but with elections, you never know what's going to come out. If I were to give numbers, I'd say it's 75-25 Chris Abele over Chris Larson right now.
All right. Patrick, let me throw this one to you. This is from Alan53, who says, why is the legislature dead set on fast-track ramrodding bills that have no public input, no hearings, no consultation with affected parties? He cites the latest example of the concealed carry bill on campuses that he says that no one but the bill's backers seem to want. Is that your sense of how these things are moving in Madison, or what's their strategy on some of these things?
I would say no with the concealed carry bill. We talked about that earlier today. I don't think that that's on a fast track. I mean, I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but it is not moving at the pace, for instance, that the Government Accountability Board and campaign finance laws are moving. Now, those bills, I guess it's a matter of perspective as to whether they're on a fast track. The Republicans have been saying for more than a year that they were going to make changes to the John Doe system. They were going to make changes to the Accountability Board. But they only recently figured out the specific changes that they wanted to make to the Accountability Board. They introduced it last week. They had a hearing on it Tuesday. Today, the committee is going to approve it, maybe with some minor modifications, and then on Tuesday it'll be on the floor of the Assembly. So in terms of details, yes, they're moving very fast. Legislatures are known for being able to move grindingly slow at times and with alarming speed when they want to get something done, and this is something the leadership wants to get done.
I understand the annoyance with the question, having covered the legislature for 6 years. Legislators frequently act as if the public is an annoyance, and if they have to let them in, they let them in, but they want to get certain things done. They only let the public in when they want to stall something or keep something from getting done.
All right, let me quick throw in this last question before we run out of time. This is from We Don't Want Him. And the question is, so what is your bet? I'll throw this, Dan, is about how much money Scott Walker had in his campaign account. Was it down to zero, or was that just cover for the real reason he got out, that his campaign was dead man walking? So this report comes out at some point today, our first real picture of the numbers.
So I'm supposed to predict what's going to happen later today.
I think they're going to... Lots of money, little money, what's in there?
There's going to be little or no money, I think. I mean, I think everybody was stunned when it came out how many people were working on the campaign, 90 people. That's an amazing amount. And I think there are other numbers that are going to come out that are going to be amazing. How much money is being spent per day, what people actually were doing with the campaign. So I do think, his numbers were plummeting, but also there was concern internally about whether the Walkers personally would have some sort of liability as a result of the debts that they were ringing up with the campaign.
All right, well, we'll leave it there because we're out of time, but please check back later to jsonline.com for some updates on that story, and check back next week where we'll be back for another edition of JS on Politics. Thank you.